Have you ever wondered why old manga used to look like this? A row of rigid panels, packed with words and barely any motion. And now they look like this, with dynamic panel layouts, characters jumping out of the panels, and massive sound effects filling the pages, creating a sense of movement. Well, this one-shot manga from 1947 is the key to that evolution. So why did its creator abandon his career as a doctor to pursue a profession that, at the time, didn't even exist? How did he become the most influential artist in anime and manga history, and arguably in modern history? And what do bugs, the US occupation of Japan, real-life ninjas, Walt Disney, 18th century literature, and silent films have to do with it? But more importantly, how did a 19-year-old change the anime and manga industry forever? That's what I wanted to find out. But as I dug deeper into this story, I discovered something far more fascinating, tragic, and ultimately inspiring than I ever expected. So stick around as we break down what makes this manga so special. The first thing you need to know about Osamu Tezuka is that he was an idealist and a dreamer. He wanted to change the world, even if it meant doing things no one had done before, even at the cost of his own health. And believe me, it's a miracle he managed to achieve what he did, considering what he went through. But to understand why he was like that, you just have to look at the way he was raised. Born in Toyonaka in 1928 to a fairly well-off family, Osamu Tezuka was a very sensitive kid. Quite sensitive, I would say. A crybaby, really. Which is ironic when you consider that he was a descendant of Hattori Hanzo. Yes, that Hattori Hanzo. When he got back from school, he would often boast to his mother how he only cried 7 times that day. But strangely enough, despite what you might think, this didn't make him unpopular with his classmates. Sure, they might tease him occasionally, but he was actually quite beloved. He always entertained his friends by telling them exaggerated, not to say made up, stories about things that happened to him or his friends. You see, from a very young age, Osamu was surrounded by art and storytelling. In the neighborhood where he grew up, several actresses from an all-female theater group lived, with whom Osamu constantly interacted. He himself admitted that from a very young age, he always slept with his sketchbook, and if he didn't have it, he would cry, sometimes forcing his mother, without his knowledge, to erase the drawings in his notebooks so he would have more space to draw. However, the figure who most influenced his career as an artist was undoubtedly his father, as he helped give Tezuka's work the personal touch that would later distinguish his manga. Tezuka's father owned a photography studio and was a big movie fan. He introduced him to the world of movies. Tezuka became a fan of silent film stars like Charles Chaplin and Buster Keaton, fascinated by how they could convey so much without a single word. But his favorite artist was undoubtedly Walt Disney. Osamu was captivated by Disney's stories, especially Bambi, which was his favorite and which, according to legend, he went to see more than 80 times in a row in its release. This love and fascination with Disney stayed with him throughout his life. In other words, Osamu Tezuka was the first Disney adult in history. This, along with his love for sci-fi stories by authors like Unojusa, inspired him to draw manga. However, something you need to understand about manga from that era is that it was very different from what we understand as manga today. Back then, these were usually short stories of just 1 or a few pages, without continuity between episodes, with little text and onomatopoeia, which followed a very rigid format where all panels tended to be a series of squares of the same size. In fact, a remnant of this type of manga are the so-called 4 komas, which follow the same structure of a series of rigid panels. You know, stories like Komi-san Can't Communicate, K-On!, or Monthly Girls Nozaki-kun, which, although they can deviate a bit from the format, tend to follow it for the most part. Manga in this era had 2 main publication methods. The first was as newspaper comic strips, which largely explains the rigid format of stiff, squared panels that manga had at the time, as newspapers were basically produced on an assembly line, and any deviation would cause problems when it came to publishing. The other was akahon, or red books. These were cheap publications, printed on low-quality paper with red covers, aimed primarily at children. They were usually just reprints of those newspaper comic strips I mentioned a moment ago, in a format of about 100 to 150 pages. It wasn't really such an important format when compared to the impact of newspaper strips, but not for long, as our young Osamu would change that. Anyway, Tezuka kept drawing manga simply as a hobby, and kept improving by drawing things like bugs, as he was an avid insect collector, a hobby very common among Japanese children of the time. This is just my own conclusion, but I feel that drawing such complex things as insects, which have various joints, silhouettes, and very different body parts, helped him develop his skill. And this is something I want to emphasize. Many people tend to think that Tezuka didn't know how to draw, but that's not true. This image of insect comics you've been seeing isn't an image. It's actually a drawing Tezuka made in his youth. The guy could draw very well when he wanted to. The Tezuka style that you probably know is just that, a style. And why did Tezuka use that style? Well, what happened is that since Tezuka was a big fan of Disney, especially Donald Duck comics by Carl Barks, the latter in particular, it ended up inspiring Tezuka's manga. This style is something fundamental to understanding why his art had the impact it did, and in a moment, I'll explain why. But first, we need to review two fundamental moments for this story, the first in Tezuka's life and the second in the history of Japan. The years passed, and Tezuka continued writing manga despite sometimes getting into trouble at school because of it. However, Tezuka was fortunate to have teachers like his third grade teacher, Mr. Anai, who encouraged him to keep drawing. By the time Tezuka was in middle school, World War II had begun, and to maintain control over the population, the Japanese government had started taking control over schools. This can be seen reflected in the uniforms of students from that era. The typical uniforms seen in anime, like the one worn by Jotaro from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or Yusuke from Yu Yu Hakusho, are actually Japanese military uniforms, cap included and all. In fact, some schools still use these uniforms to this day. Yeah, that's something. Anyway, during this time, things like playing music or drawing at school were strongly discouraged, as they were seen as wasting time and energy when your country needed you most. However, Tezuka was lucky to meet Mr. Ozaki, another teacher, in this case an art teacher, who noticed his talent and encouraged him to continue drawing, which is why he continued with his passion. While doing a military drill at school, yikes, Tezuka received a vaccine with a contaminated, which caused his arm to become infected. No big deal, right? Tezuka just had to go to the doctor to get it treated, and that would be it. But there his doctor told him something shocking, that he had been extremely fortunate. If he had waited a bit longer, he could have suffered from blood poisoning and lost his arm, and with it, most likely his passion for drawing, ending his story as a manga artist before it had even begun. The experience impacted Tezuka so much that it made him reflect on his life and prompted him to decide to become a doctor for children. And then we arrived at the 1940s, the nuclear bomb, and the end of World War II. In some places like the US, the end of the war was greeted with applause and smiles. But for obvious reasons, in Japan, it was quite the opposite. It wasn't uncommon to find bodies decomposing in the middle of the street, not as direct consequences of the bomb, but because people were starving, because everyone was in the same situation, as the country had been destroyed by the war. No one had time to take care of the bodies in the middle of the street. And this is what a young Tezuka grew up seeing. If you've ever wondered why manga from the 60s, 70s, and to some extent 80s was so raw, rough, and violent at times, it's because their creators were raised seeing this. But back to Tezuka. In his own words, he had to see the worst side of humanity. He was living hell on earth, and it's not hard to imagine that living during that period marked him very strongly. But as I mentioned, like a character from a shonen anime, Tezuka was always an optimist. He always wanted to think the best of people, and truly believed that the reason wars occurred was because people were unable to communicate properly, especially when they didn't even speak the same language. We can see this type of idea reflected in works of his like Jungle Emperor Leo, a story where the plot revolves around how animals try to live in peace with humanity, but because they are unable to communicate, the story ends tragically. If this anime manga doesn't sound familiar to you, you might know it by its other name, Kimba the White Lion. You know, that story that Disney definitely did not copy to make The Lion King. Funny how sometimes things come full circle. This thinking, plus living during this turbulent period of Japan's history, gave him a sense of wanting to express himself even more. He wanted to create something that would help Japanese people get through these difficult times by entertaining them and giving them some hope, and he would choose the medium of manga to achieve this. Two stories that serve to understand Osamu Tezuka and his stories very well are when during the US occupation of Japan, he was once playing a Mozart song on a piano at the YMCA, when suddenly an American soldier arrived and began to sing along with him an opera song that accompanied what Tezuka was playing. Despite both having problems communicating due to the language barrier, they became good friends, and Tezuka made a portrait for Joe, the soldier, who in response gave him several American comics, including a Donald Duck comic by Carl Barks. This would become fundamental for Tezuka's development as an artist, as seeing these comics opened him to a new world of techniques he didn't know could be achieved in the art of comics, manga. The second story that helps understand Tezuka wasn't as pleasant. One day, walking on the street, he accidentally bumped shoulders with a US soldier, and in response, this soldier punched him. Tezuka was very confused. He couldn't understand what had happened or what the soldier was saying, so he didn't know if he had offended him or done something wrong. These two experiences marked and intrigued him, as two such similar experiences had such different outcomes, and in both cases, communication was key, which reinforced his idea that through communication, peace might be possible. However, it would be wrong to think that Tezuka was naive. naive. He was an optimist, but he wasn't foolish. Yes, sometimes his stories might have happy endings, but many times they didn't. Tezuka believed that manga readers, and by extension kids, were smart enough to handle a tragic ending, and that in fact, showing them that things don't always have a happy ending would help them grow as people. After graduating from high school, Tezuka entered university to become a children's doctor. However, he didn't abandon his passion for manga, and at the young age of 17, he managed to enter the manga industry with Diary of Machin, his first published work, which actually became a success. It even had toys made. Of course, Tezuka didn't receive any payment for these toys. You see, during that time, manga artists only received a flat fee of 3,000 yen per manga, or $5 at the time, around $71 in 2025 money. This meant that no matter how well your work did, you as a manga artist would still earn the same. And the same thing applied to toys or any merchandise. This made earning a living as a manga artist almost impossible back then. That's why it's surprising that Tezuka's reaction upon seeing someone monetizing his creation was joy instead of anger. He was happy that his work was a success. He was that kind of person. However, his big break came that same year when a neighbor who worked at a local newspaper got him a gig there, ultimately leading to a meeting with other manga artists, where he met Sakai Shichima, a very renowned manga artist of the time, who, after seeing Tezuka's talent, offered him the opportunity that would ultimately catapult him to stardom and allow him to finally start his great career as a manga artist. He invited him to create New Treasure Island, a continuous single-volume story of almost 200 pages. This was more than revolutionary for the time. Back then, doing something like this was unthinkable. It was a huge leap, like if a child from the 60s who grew up watching Adam West's Batman, with its exaggerated characters, plots, onomatopoeias on the screen, and self-contained episodes, was suddenly shown the Dark Knight movie trilogy. It would blow your mind. And do you want to hear something really crazy? This isn't even the most impressive thing about New Treasure Island, nor the main reason why it's one of the most influential manga in history. But first, let's cover the basics. Sakai Shichima served as editor and provided the original idea for the story, which consisted of a loose reimagining of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island. Tezuka would do the art and adapt Sakai's idea to manga. So basically, Sakai would handle most of the overarching story, and Tezuka would create the dialogues, contribute some ideas, draw the art, and change some elements. The story starts with our main character, a boy named Pete, who found a treasure island map left by his late father and decided to search for the treasure island alongside a ship captain and a stray dog. Along the way, the group got attacked by a band of pirates led by a man named Boar, who lost a limb in a fight with a shark, who demands the map. After a little battle during a storm, our main characters got stranded at sea. They reach the island on the map, get captured by a cannibal tribe, and later by Boar's pirates, but are saved by a Tarzan-like character named Baron, who befriends the animals on the treasure island and guards the hidden treasure. After a few more events where the pirates cause problems for Pete and his friends, the group manages to outrace the pirates and find the treasure with Baron's help. They manage to escape the treasure island after the captain's crew finds them, while the pirates who followed the map are led into a trap where they are imprisoned by the island's animals. Pete then plans to use the treasure they found to build a large zoo on the treasure island for children from all around the world to visit. As it turns out, the island, for some strange reason, has animals from all over the world. That is, if you read the original 1947 version as the 1980s revision that Tezuka made, which more closely resembles what he originally wanted to do before Sakai Shichima exercised his role as editor and cut 60 pages from the story. Has an original ending with a plot twist that I won't spoil in case you want to read it. As you may have noticed, the story is quite simple and nothing extraordinary if you read it with 2025 glasses. However, it's important to put it in context. Imagine you're a child in 1947, which remember was almost 80 years ago. It's not far from being a century since New Treasure Island was printed. At that time, the anime industry didn't exist, nor even the word anime. Back then, they used the word doga, or moving images, because yes, Japanese animation existed, but it consisted of a few animated films, some shorts, most being government propaganda for World War II, and that was it. And on the manga side, everything was short stories, sometimes just a single page, without an overarching story or any continuous narrative for the most part. The majority, if not practically all titles, were self-contained stories. The world could end, and for the next chapter, they would act like nothing happened, which isn't bad in itself, but is very limiting when you want to evolve an artistic medium and use it to explore more complex ideas. And And then Tezuka and Sakai arrive with this story that has a beginning, middle, and end, with character arcs. Granted, they aren't groundbreaking arcs, but at the time, this was revolutionary in the world of manga. Plus, there are stakes because the story has plot twists, multiple scenarios that provide visual variety, battles and characters can die, and several actually do. On top of that, at the end, it includes an environmentalist message, which wasn't so common at the time. Sure, it's not the best message. After all, it's about building a zoo, but the intention and heart were there. However, what cements New Treasure Island in the Mount Rushmore of manga isn't just that. This is only a small part. What made New Treasure Island what it is its art and how it communicates through it. Tezuka's drawing isn't bad, but it is simple, drawing much inspiration from Disney's work, especially Donald Duck comics, as I mentioned. However, where he shines is in his composition. Tezuka uses the 4-panel style we've already discussed, but what's interesting is what he does within that limitation and how he innovates in multiple ways. The story begins slowly, without a single dialogue. We only see a child's face zoomed in, which slowly zooms that he's driving, apparently at high speed. We assume from the way it's drawn that he's in a hurry to get somewhere. On the next 2 pages, we can see how this zoom out pattern continues to show us the forest-like setting where we are. And on the 4th and 5th pages, there's a change. Instead of zooming out, as the previous 3 pages had accustomed us to, here we have the opposite, a zoom in, first slow, and then faster, and more abrupt on the following page, selling without words, almost like the silent films that Tezuka watched and loved as a kid. The idea that something important is happening, and making us as an audience wonder, what happened? Did the boy finally reach his destination? Did his brakes fail? Is he about to fall off a cliff? Well, before answering what happened to the boy, I first want to focus on how this last page is structured, where the boy gradually gets closer. But notice how from the 3rd panel on, he's no longer centered. Instead, the camera slowly wants us to focus on one of his eyes, and upon turning the page, we realize why. The boy is about to run over a dog, but Tezuka doesn't just show it like that. First, he shows it in the reflection of the boy's eye, continuing the sequence from the previous page, and we quickly zoom in on this image until, without realizing it, by the end of the page, we're no longer seeing the reflection in the boy's eye, but the dog itself. It's a pretty smooth transition, like that scene from Contact, only done in reverse. In just 6 pages, the manga has managed to convey a lot without saying a single word. What I want to highlight here is how Tezuka introduces a novel technique for the manga world, and really for comics in general, as it wasn't widely used there either. He establishes a mood using camera angles and shots. Here you can see the influence of cinema on Tezuka in his handling of time, as the beginning of the manga is very cinematographic, for lack of a better word. But just as importantly, this technique helps establish a rhythm by making the first 3 pages follow the same pace of zooming out, moving away little by little, only to later break with this by doing the opposite, making the moment more impactful due to the setup created in the previous 3 pages. And yes, the 4-panel format prevents this technique from being as impactful as it could have been. A greater variety in panel types, perhaps characters or events that broke out of the frames, would increase the impact and enjoyment of the scene. But guess what? Tezuka also innovated by inventing many of those techniques in his future works, so he deserves credit for that too. The man was working with many limitations. He had to follow the standards established by publishers, and if you compare it with other manga from the era, the change is very noticeable. Any other manga from back then would have shown, in panel 1, the boy driving, in the 2nd, the dog coming up to the street, in the 3rd, the boy braking, and in the 4th, the boy on the street with the dog. It would have been very straightforward, lacking dynamism, without mood, showing the most bare-bones version of the story, as if we were just looking at one of those books they sell about Disney movies, where they just put an image of the most important moments and summarize the story. It's simply like they don't take much advantage of their medium, almost as if they weren't manga. They don't get the most out of it or experiment with techniques. But that's not all, as Tezuka uses more revolutionary techniques. For example, my favorite is this one during the fight on the ship during the storm. Here, the ship is supposed to be moving from side to side. To convey that idea in a very dynamic way, Tezuka uses a revolutionary new technique, which today is the most basic skill any manga artist or comic creator must know how to use: directing the reader. It's as basic as if a writer didn't know how to write well, or a director who didn't know how to properly direct the camera. Notice how here the pirate pushes his sword so that the second character, due to the movement of the ship, moves to the other side, and then following him, the pirate pushes his sword again, only for the second character once more, due to the movement of the ship, to escape again. This entire page does 2 things. First, it creates a clear zigzag line that guides the reader through the page, which makes the action scene more dynamic and easier to follow. And second, by making us move from one side to the other, it shows, without saying a single word, how the ship is in the middle of a storm storm and is moving from side to side as we as readers are experiencing that same movement. Or notice how in this other one, where the villains are climbing a mountain and form a straight line downward, which seems to imply that there's a great distance between them, selling more effectively the idea that they're climbing an enormous mountain. Or this one that occurs on the next page, where in the first panel we see the villains struggling to pull the rope, and in the next we see the rope breaking, and in the third we see what the rope was carrying, creating a metaphorical physical rope that unites the three panels, making the action of the rope breaking stronger in the mind of the readers. And again, Tezuka creates a clear line to guide the reader that conveys the idea of exactly what is happening in the story without telling it to our face. I could mention many more examples from New Treasure Island, but I'd be here all day. After all this, it shouldn't be a surprise to know that New Treasure Island was a gigantic success in the industry, never seen before. It sold the monstrous amount, for the time, of 400,000 copies, which might not sound like much today, with Demon Slayer selling almost 100 million copies in a year, or One Piece moving more than 500 million units. But in 1947, this was extraordinary. I couldn't find the best-selling manga of the era. The closest I could find was that in the 70s, the best-selling manga was Astro Boy by Tezuka himself, which after multiple volumes and decades on the market had sold 10 million copies. So if we consider that New Treasure Island has only one volume, came out almost 3 decades earlier, in the midst of a Japan destroyed by war, and the market then was not the global industry it is today, it's safe to say it was quite an event, kicking off the so-called golden age of manga. And indeed, it not only influenced multiple future works, catapulting Tezuka in the process and making him the most influential and important manga artist in history, allowing him to create many more works of worldwide success, the first successful TV anime, which literally created the business model that anime series continue to use to this day, and which allowed anime to become popular worldwide. But it did the same for the manga industry. Today, the most popular format for manga, and by which its success is usually measured, is the number of volumes sold, called tankobons, which is the same format Tezuka used for New Treasure Island, except that at that time, they weren't called tankobons, but akahon, or red books. This format would allow manga to not only become popular in Japan, but in the rest of the world, since because these tankobons or volumes were in black and white, their production costs were very low, allowing them to compete in countries outside Japan with comics of more established characters like Spider-Man, Superman, or Batman, because for less money, they gave you a more extensive story per issue. All of this culminated in 2024, with more than 60% of graphic novels comics sold in the USA being manga, and One Piece, which began publication in 1997, being about to surpass in sales the best-selling comic in history, Superman, a character that has existed since 1938. In other words, New Treasure Island is the foundation that allowed anime and manga to become the $34 billion global juggernaut that it is today, which, for scale, if it were a country, would put it above the GDP of 78 countries. And all this thanks to the fact that it essentially created all the artistic techniques that would allow various artists to build upon what he did, making the medium evolve in an infinity of ways, genres, and stories that would make millions of people fall in love with not only his works, by inspiring and giving them hope, like he wanted to do all those years ago. But the whole medium, not bad for a crybaby, right? Thanks for watching.